The next 3 days were spent in a frenzy of administrative defense. With Garmin gone and the staff paid, the immediate bleeding of the estate had stopped, but a tourniquet is not a cure. I sat in my study, looking at the map of the capital spread out before me. To win a war, you need more than just a fortress. You need to know the battlefield, and my battlefield was out there, in the streets of Ethelgard. I couldn't walk out the front door as Aric Valorian. My reputation was still poison. In the eyes of the public, I was still the drunkard, the fool who married a genius mage. If I went to the markets wearing my noble crest, I would be swindled by merchants or mocked by my peers. I would be a target. No, I needed to see the city as it truly was, naked and unfiltered. I needed to see it from the ground level. I opened the wardrobe. I pushed aside the silks and the velvets, the uniform of the predator class. I reached for something else, a heavy, rough-spun wool coat in a dull brown. High collar, practical buttons. I found a pair of simple wire-rimmed reading glasses in my father's desk. I stood before the mirror. I tied my black hair back with a simple leather cord. I put on the glasses. The transformation was subtle, but effective. The arrogance of the noble was gone. In his place stood a scholar, perhaps a university researcher or a merchant's clerk. I was no longer a lord. I was invisible. "Sebastian," I called out as I descended the stairs. The butler appeared instantly. He looked different now. He stood taller. His eyes held a spark of purpose that hadn't been there a week ago. "Prepare the unmarked carriage, the black one. No crests, no flags, and tell the driver to wear plain clothes." Sebastian hesitated for a fraction of a second. "You intend to go to the lower district, sir? Alone? It is unstable these days. The tension between the races is high." "I know," I replied, checking the hidden pockets of my coat where I had stashed a bag of gold coins. "That is exactly why I need to go. Danger is just data you haven't analyzed yet, Sebastian. I need to understand the variables of this city before I can manipulate them." "Shall I send a guard detail in plain clothes to shadow you?" "No," I said firmly. "Guards attract attention. Fear attracts attention. I will be just another face in the crowd." I stepped out into the cool morning air. The carriage ride took me away from the silence of the noble district. Through the window, I watched the world transform. The white marble mansions and manicured gardens gave way to timber, brick, and stone. The streets became narrower, the architecture more chaotic. This was Ethelgard's capital, a sprawling beast of a city. From my books, I knew the theory of this place. I knew the population statistics, the trade routes, the tax laws. But seeing it was different. An engineer can read a blueprint, but only a builder knows the weight of the stone. I saw the segregation written into the very architecture. The elves walked on raised walkways, connected by bridges of white stone, literally looking down on the rest of the population. They were surrounded by magical bodyguards, their clothes glowing with faint enchantments. They looked at the humans below, not with hate, but with the indifference one might feel for an ant. Below them, the humans dominated the main streets. Merchants, soldiers, craftsmen. It was loud, aggressive, and vibrant. And then, pushed to the edges, were the others. The dwarves carrying crates 3 times their size, ignored by everyone. The beastkin huddled in the shadows of the alleyways. We approached the checkpoint between the upper and lower districts. The carriage slowed to a crawl. Through the glass, I witnessed the reality of this world's law. A group of city guards, humans in polished steel armor, had stopped a merchant cart. The merchant was a foxkin, an older male with graying fur on his ears. He wasn't blocking the road. He wasn't breaking any law. One of the guards laughed and kicked the wheel of the cart. It wasn't an accident. It was a calculated strike to the weakest point of the axle. The wood snapped, the cart tipped. Apples and manna fruits rolled into the mud. The guard didn't help. He stepped on a fruit,
crushing it under his metal boot, smiling as the merchant scrambled on his knees to salvage his livelihood. The crowd walked past, averting their eyes. It wasn't cruelty for the sake of cruelty. It was a demonstration of power, a reminder of who owns the streets. I felt a surge of adrenaline in my chest, a reflex from my old life on Earth where justice was an ideal we pretended to uphold. My hand twitched towards the door handle. I wanted to step out. I wanted to use my status, my voice, to stop it. But I stopped myself. Logic over emotion, I told myself. Always. If I step out now, I reveal myself. I become Aric Valorian again. I save one merchant, but I lose my anonymity. I lose my strategic advantage. I am not strong enough to change the system yet. If I fight the current now, I will drown. I forced my hand to let go of the handle. I watched the merchant cry in the mud, and I burned that image in my mind. I filed it away in my memory, not as a tragedy, but as ammunition. This kingdom is rotten. The structural integrity of this society is failing, and when a structure is weak, it is easy to topple. I signaled the driver to stop at the edge of the market district, a few blocks away from the incident. "Wait here," I told him through the hatch. "If I am not back in 3 hours, return to the manor and tell Sebastian to open the red file." I stepped out onto the cobblestones. The smell hit me instantly. A complex chemical mix of exotic spices, unwashed bodies, ozone from mana crystals, and roasting meat. The noise was deafening. This was where the real economy flowed. This was where the illegal and the legal blurred together. I adjusted my glasses and pulled my collar up. I checked the list in my pocket. I wasn't here for food or clothes. I was here for components. I was looking for things that no mage would ever buy because no mage would understand their value. I took a deep breath of the dirty city air. The architect was in the field, and it was time to go shopping. I merged into the crowd. For the first time in this new life, I was not surrounded by stone walls and silence. I was surrounded by the chaotic, beating heart of the city. To the average noble, this crowd would look like a dirty, unwashed mass of peasantry. But to me, it looked like a flow of data. I moved with the current of people, keeping my head down, adjusting my pace to match the rhythm of the street. My disguise was holding. No one looked twice at the scholar in the brown coat. I was irrelevant to them, and that anonymity was intoxicating. I walked past stalls selling low-grade mana shards, the fuel of this world. I saw the prices. Exorbitant. The mages controlled the supply, artificially inflating the cost to keep the common folk dependent. It was basic economics, weaponized to maintain a class divide. If you can't afford fuel, you can't heat your home. You can't power your tools. You can't rise. But the economic disparity was just the surface. As I ventured deeper into the lower city, the true ugliness of Aethelgard revealed itself. I stopped near a construction site. A new temple was being erected for the glory of the High Church. Massive blocks of granite were being lifted into place. But there were no cranes, there were no pulleys, and there were no human workers. Instead, there were ogres and heavy-set beastkin. They were chained together in teams of 10, hauling stone blocks that would crush a human flat. Their muscles strained, their skin raw where the iron collars rubbed against their necks. Standing over them was a single human overseer with a mana whip, ready to punish any sign of fatigue. I watched, analyzing the scene not with pity, but with an engineer's frustration. It was inefficient. They were using biological assets, strong, resilient creatures, and working them to death for short-term gain. On Earth, we learned that a well-fed, well-equipped worker is 10 times more productive than a slave. But here, this kingdom ran on the logic of fear, not efficiency. They wasted potential because they were too arrogant to see these creatures as anything other than tools. I continued walking, my jaw set tight. I passed a group of elves visiting the market from the upper district. They walked in a bubble of silence, the crowd parting before them like water. I overheard their conversation. They weren't speaking of philosophy or art. They were complaining about the smell of the animals around them. The racism here wasn't just a social habit, it was structural. It was the load-bearing wall of their entire society. Humans and elves at the top, the races with high mana aptitude. Dwarves in the middle, tolerated for their craftsmanship but socially isolated. And the demi-humans at the bottom, the beastkin, the lichens, the hybrids, those with low mana but high physical stats, were treated as livestock. I realized, then, why the old Aric was such a failure. He was a mana null. In this hierarchy, a human with no magic is a glitch in the matrix, a defect. I was technically lower than a commoner in the eyes of the magical elite. The only thing protecting me was my family name and my title. Without those, I would be in the mud with the rest of them. I reached a public square. A town crier was reading a proclamation from the king. By decree of the Royal Academy, all unlicensed mechanical devices are hereby banned. Any citizen found in possession of non-magical technology deemed subversive will be fined and imprisoned. I stopped and listened closely. Banning technology. Banning mechanics. Why? Because technology is the great equalizer. A crossbow requires no mana to fire. A steam engine requires no wizard to run. If the common folk had technology, the mages would lose their monopoly on power. The king wasn't protecting the people. He was protecting the status quo. He was afraid of progress. A slow, dangerous smile touched my lips beneath my high collar. They were afraid of technology. They were afraid of things they couldn't control with a spell. Good. That meant they had a blind spot, a massive, gaping structural weakness in their defenses. They were preparing for a magical war, putting up shields against fireballs and lightning. They weren't looking for physics. They weren't looking for chemistry. They weren't looking for me. I checked my list again. The items I needed weren't illegal, not yet, but they were considered junk by the mages. Sulfur, charcoal, saltpeter, high tensile steel springs, precision lenses. I turned down a narrow alleyway, away from the main thoroughfare. The maps in my library indicated a district known as the Iron Quarter, a place where the dwarves and the outcasts lived, a place where the smell of magic was replaced by the smell of oil and rust. If I was going to build a weapon to kill a mage, I wouldn't find the parts in a magic shop. I would find them in the trash heap of their civilization. The architect was about to start.
I left the Iron Quarter behind for a moment and headed towards the district that served as the buffer between the rich and the poor, the Adventurers Guild. The building itself was a fortress of dark wood and iron reinforcement. It didn't look welcoming. It looked like a bunker. Above the double doors hung a sign depicting a broken sword and a shield, a grim reminder that in their line of work, survival is not guaranteed. I pushed the doors open. The noise hit me like a physical blow. It was a chaotic symphony of shouting, tankards slamming against wood, and the heavy clanking of armor. The air here was thick, hot, and smelled of stale ale, sweat, and dried blood. I moved to a dark corner, ordering a simple water from a serving girl who looked like she could break my arm if I didn't tip well. I sat down and did what I do best. I observed.
The clientele was a mix of desperate souls and adrenaline junkies. I saw teams of young mages, arrogant in their clean robes, laughing about burning a goblin village. I saw scarred veterans, missing eyes or fingers, drinking in silence, trying to drown the memories of what lived in the dark. I focused my attention on a group of mercenaries at the next table. They were arguing over a map. "You can't take a steel wolf with a standard blade, you idiot!" one of them shouted, slamming a dagger onto the table. He was a grizzled warrior with a magical prosthetic arm. "Their fur is reinforced with mana. A normal sword just bounces off. You need an enchanter to strip the barrier first." I leaned in slightly, absorbing the information. Mana barriers. So that was the catch. The monsters in this world weren't just biological animals. They were evolved to survive in a mana-rich environment. They had natural force fields. That explained why non-mages were useless in combat. Without magic to break the shield, you couldn't hurt the beast. I took a sip of water, my mind racing. If I tried to fight a monster with a sword, I would die. I have no mana. I cannot enchant a blade. I cannot cast a barrier break spell. But physics doesn't care about magic. A barrier is just energy, and energy can be overwhelmed if the kinetic impact is concentrated enough on a single point. I didn't need a spell to break a shield. I needed velocity, high-velocity impact. I looked at the massive quest board on the far wall. It was plastered with notices: Wanted, Wyvern, Bounty, Bandit Leader. But my eyes scanned for something specific. I wasn't looking for money. I was looking for anomalies. Then I saw it, a black notice, pinned at the very bottom, almost covered by other papers. Warning: dimensional instability detected in the Western Ruins. High concentration of void energy. Do not approach. Royal Mages investigating. Dimensional instability. Void energy. My heart skipped a beat. This was it. The star travelers my grandfather wrote about. If there was a way back to Earth, it would be found in those anomalies. I memorized the location, the Western Ruins. But the notice also said Royal Mages investigating. That was a problem. If I went there now, unarmed and powerless, I would either be killed by the void monsters or arrested by the mages. I needed to be ready. I needed to be able to kill things that magic struggled to kill. And I needed to do it before Elara returned. I stood up, leaving a gold coin on the table, too much for water, but enough for the serving girl to forget she ever saw a scholar in a brown coat. I had the target, the Western Ruins. I had the obstacle, mana barriers. Now I needed the solution. I walked out of the guild, back into the noise of the street. My path was clear now. I didn't need a blacksmith. I needed an engineer. I needed someone who understood that sometimes a gear is stronger than a spell. I turned my collar up against the wind and headed straight to the Iron Quarter, to the workshop of the one race that hated mages as much as I did. It was time to meet the Dwarves.
To reach the Iron Quarter, the map led me through a district that didn't appear on the official tourist guides. The locals called it Shadow Lane. The noise of the guild faded behind me, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. Here, deals were made in whispers. The air was colder, smelling of rust and damp fur. I walked past stalls selling poisons, unauthorized potions, and stolen heirlooms. But those were just the appetizers. The main attraction was further down, the slave market. In Aethelgard, slavery of lesser races wasn't just legal, it was a cornerstone of the economy. I stopped at the edge of the square, adjusting my glasses to hide the disgust in my eyes. Rows of iron cages lined the street. Inside them were not animals, but people.
demi-humans. I saw a wolfkin warrior, his spirit broken, chained to a post. I saw a catkin mother, holding her child, hissing at anyone who came too close. A merchant approached me. He was a human, dressed in fine silks, but with dirt under his fingernails. He rubbed his hands together like a fly cleaning its legs. Looking for labor, Sir Scholar? Or perhaps companionship? We have fresh stock from the border skirmishes. Strong backs, obedient minds. And if they aren't obedient, well, the collars handle that. He tapped a metal rod against the bars of a small cage.
Inside, a young raccoon-kin girl flinched. She looked starving. Her eyes were dull, dead. She had accepted her fate. I felt a wave of nausea. On Earth, I was an engineer. I built bridges to connect people. Here, they built cages to sell them. My hand drifted to the bag of gold in my coat. I could buy her. I had enough money. I could buy her freedom right now. I could be the hero. Ideally, I would burn this entire market to the ground. No. The voice of logic cut through my emotion like a scalpel. Think, Aric. Analyze. If I buy her, what then? I bring her to a manor that is barely standing? I have no magic to remove her slave collar. Only a licensed mage can do that. If I free her here, she will be recaptured in an hour. If I take her with me, I become a target. I am undercover. A scholar buying a slave is normal. A scholar freeing a slave is a radical. I looked at the girl one last time. For a second, our eyes met. I didn't see hope in hers. I saw nothing. I unclenched my fist, releasing the gold coins inside my pocket. "Not today," I said to the merchant, my voice flat and cold. "I am looking for tools, not pets." The merchant shrugged and moved on to the next customer. I turned away and walked. I walked faster than before. I felt dirty. I felt complicit. This is what weakness feels like, knowing what is right, but lacking the power to enforce it. I saved that feeling. I bottled that rage and put it next to the image of Garmin. I cannot save them today, I told myself, the rhythm of my boots hitting the cobblestones. I cannot save them with gold. I cannot save them with kindness. To change this system, I don't need to be a savior. I need to be a conqueror. I reached the end of Shadow Lane. Ahead of me, the smoke of the Iron Quarter rose into the sky. The sound of hammers ringing on steel filled the air. I was done with emotions. I was done with pity. Pity doesn't break chains. Weapons do. It was time to find the dwarf. Before committing to the Iron Quarter, I had to be sure. Absolutely sure. I stepped out of the shadows and entered the commercial district. Here, the shops were clean. They were built of polished stone and glass, displaying their wares like jewels. I stopped in front of a shop named the Azure Spark, Enchantments and Defense. Through the window, I saw swords that glowed with an internal blue light, staffs that hummed with energy. It looked impressive. It looked powerful. I pushed the door open. A bell chimed. Not a mechanical bell, but a magical tone that vibrated in the air. The shopkeeper was a young man in pristine robes. He looked up from a ledger, scanning me with bored eyes. My brown scholar's coat told him I wasn't rich, but I wasn't a beggar either. "Standard defense wands are on the left," he said, not bothering to stand up. "Mana crystals are in the back. Don't touch the high-grade artifacts unless you intend to buy." I walked to the counter. I am not looking for a wand. I am looking for a blade. Something autonomous. The shopkeeper raised an eyebrow. "Autonomous? You mean self-powered? That's expensive, scholar." He reached under the counter and pulled out a short sword. It was beautiful. The steel was etched with glowing runes. "Standard issue City Guard Gladius. reinforced with a kinetic amplifier. Even a child can cut through stone with this. Give it a try." He placed it on the velvet counter. I reached out and grasped the hilt. In this world, when a mage touches an enchanted object, the circuit completes. The mana flows from the body into the weapon, activating the runes. It should hum, it should glow brighter, it should feel lighter. I held it. Nothing happened. The runes didn't flare. The blade remained heavy, cold, and lifeless steel. It was just a sharp piece of metal. I squeezed the handle, trying to force something, anything out of my core. But there was nothing. It was like trying to start a fire in a vacuum. The shopkeeper frowned. He leaned over the counter, looking at the sword, then at me. His expression shifted from boredom to confusion, and finally, to pity. "Ah," he said, pulling the sword back. "I see. The mechanism isn't broken." He looked at me with a sneer. "You are a null, a void-born." He wiped the handle of the sword with a rag, as if my touch had contaminated it. "This is a shop for mages, sir. We sell tools for those who have the capacity to use them. Perhaps you should try the blacksmith down the street. He sells pitchforks. That seems more your speed." The humiliation was sharp, calculated. To him, I wasn't a customer, I was a cripple. I adjusted my glasses, keeping my face impassive. "Thank you for the demonstration," I said calmly. "Your inventory is impressive, but you are right. It is not compatible." I turned and walked out. The magical chime of the door mocked me as I left. I stood on the sidewalk, watching the mages walk by, their bodies radiating faint auras of power. I wasn't angry anymore. I was relieved. The test was conclusive. The hypothesis is confirmed. My body is a closed circuit. I cannot conduct mana. To them, I am broken. But to an engineer, I am just a different type of machine. If I cannot provide the spark, then I don't need a conduit weapon. I need a battery. I need a weapon that brings its own energy to the fight. I need combustion. I need chemical reaction. I need kinetic propulsion. I looked down the street toward the rising smoke of the Iron Quarter, the Dwarfen district, the place where magic was secondary to steel and fire. The shopkeeper offered me a pitchfork. I was going to come back with a cannon. I turned my collar up and walked into the smug. The experiment was over. Construction was about to begin.
I crossed the bridge into the Iron Quarter. The transition was physical. The temperature rose by 10 degrees. The air became thick with soot and the smell of hot oil. The delicate chiming of magical bells was replaced by the rhythmic, deafening clang of hammers on anvils. Here, the buildings weren't made of white marble. They were built from black iron and red brick, stained with smoke. The people here were shorter, broader, and stronger. Dwarves, the backbone of the city's infrastructure, yet treated like grease monkeys by the elite. I walked past forges making horseshoes and plows, practical things, necessary things. But I was looking for something more experimental. I found it at the end of a dead-end street, the shop that looked more like a collapsed scrap heap than a business. The sign above the door hung by a single rusty chain: Broggs Salvage and Repair. I stepped inside. The shop was a chaotic labyrinth of gears, pipes, pistons, and wires. It looked like a bomb had gone off inside a clock tower. To a mage, this place would be a nightmare. To me, it was beautiful. In the center of the room, a dwarf was hunched over a workbench, wearing thick welding goggles. He was arguing with a piece of machinery that was spewing steam. "Work, you stubborn pile of scrap!" he shouted, hitting the machine with a wrench. He was broad, with arms like tree trunks and a beard that was singed at the ends. He didn't hear me enter. I watched him for a moment.
He was trying to pressurize a steam valve, but the seal kept blowing. "The pressure ratio is off," I said, my voice cutting through the noise. "You're trying to force a 3-to-1 compression without a reduction gear. It will explode before it spins." The dwarf froze. He slowly turned around, lifting his goggles onto his forehead. He had sharp, suspicious eyes rimmed with grease. "And who might you be?" he growled. "Another academy student coming to laugh at the monkey work?" "I am a customer," I replied, stepping forward, "and I know that if you don't adjust that valve in the next 10 seconds, we are both going to be boiled alive." The dwarf grunted. He looked at the machine, then at me. He grabbed a smaller wrench and tweaked the valve. The hissing stopped. The machine hummed into a steady, rhythmic spin. He wiped his hands on a filthy rag and leaned against the bench. "Not bad for a human. Most of your kind think magic solves everything. You actually know how torque works." "Magic is convenient," I said, looking around the shop, "but mechanics are reliable. Magic fades, steel persists." The dwarf grinned, revealing a gold tooth. "I like you. Name's Brog. Welcome to the only shop in the city where mana is a dirty word." He hopped down from his stool. "So, customer, you didn't come here to fix my steam engine. You're looking for something the fancy shops uptown won't sell you." "I am looking for a delivery system," I said carefully. "I need to launch a projectile. Small, high velocity, kinetic impact." Brog scratched his beard. "Crossbow, I have plenty." "Faster," I said. "Compact, handheld. I don't want a bowstring. I want combustion or pressurized release." Brog went silent. He studied me intently, as if measuring my soul. Then he beckoned me to the back of the shop. He kicked aside a pile of rusted armor and pulled a tarp off a table. "The mages call this trash," he muttered. "They say it's useless because it doesn't regenerate ammo. They say it's too loud, too clumsy." On the table lay a collection of prototypes, tubes of reinforced steel, trigger mechanisms, chambers designed for mana crystals but wired incorrectly. They were failed wands, failed staffs. But to my eyes, they weren't failures. They were stripped-down, raw components. I saw a barrel. I saw a firing pin. I saw the potential for a weapon that this world had never seen before. I picked up a heavy steel tube. It was cold and greasy. "This one," I said, feeling the weight. "The chamber is reinforced?" "Dwarven steel," Brog nodded proudly. "It could tame a dragon's sneeze." "Perfect." I looked at Brog. "I don't just want to buy this, Brog. I want to modify it, and I need your hands to do it. Are you interested in proving the Academy wrong?" Brog's eyes lit up with a maniacal gleam. It was the look of an engineer who had finally found someone crazy enough to fund his bad ideas. "Lad," he said, grabbing a hammer, "you had me at proving the Academy wrong. Lock the door. We have work to do."
For the next 4 hours, the outside world ceased to exist. It was just me, Brog, and a table covered in blueprints. I drew diagrams on parchment using charcoal. Brog looked at them, grunting, scratching his head, and then nodding with widening eyes. To a mage, my drawings would look like gibberish. To a dwarf, they looked like a revolution. "The problem with your standard wands," I explained, pointing to the failed prototypes, "is that they rely on the user. The mage acts as the battery. If the mage is weak, the spell is weak. If the mage is empty, like me, the weapon is a stick." Brog nodded, chewing on an unlit cigar. "Aye, that's the bottleneck, the conduit." "Exactly," I said. "So we remove the conduit. We treat the mana crystal not as a focus point, but as a fuel cell, a cartridge." I picked up a small blue mana crystal.
This crystal is unstable energy. If a mage whispers to it, it glows. But what happens if you hit it hard? Brog grinned wickedly. It destabilizes. It explodes. Precisely, I said. Controlled explosion. Combustion. We don't need a spell to release the energy. We need a hammer. We got to work. Brog worked the forge, reshaping the barrel of the device. I worked on the mechanism. I designed a simple, spring-loaded firing pin. It was primitive technology from my world, the same mechanism used in early flintlock pistols, but adapted for this reality. Instead of striking flint against steel to make a spark, the hammer would strike a needle into the core of the mana crystal. The logic was simple. Load the crystal, pull the trigger. The pin shatters the crystal's casing. The energy releases instantly inside the reinforced chamber. The force is channeled out of the barrel as a beam of pure, concentrated kinetic force. It wasn't magic. It was ballistics. The sun was beginning to set when Brog finally clamped the last screw. He held the weapon up to the light. It didn't look like the elegant, gold filigreed wands of the High Elves. It was ugly. It was made of blackened steel and dark oak. It was heavy, blocky, and smelled of oil. It looked brutal. "It ain't pretty," Brog chuckled, weighing it in his hand. "The Academy would call it an abomination." "Good," I said. "Pretty doesn't kill monsters. Physics does." I gripped the handle. It fit my hand perfectly. For the first time in this world, I didn't feel powerless holding a weapon. I felt the weight of potential. "We need to test it," Brog said, wiping grease from his forehead. "But not here. If that thing fires, it'll wake up half the city guards." I nodded. "I know a place. Outside the city walls, the gray zone near the forest edge." I reached into my coat and pulled out the bag of gold. I placed a stack of coins on the workbench, triple what the parts were worth. Brog looked at the gold, then at me. "You're paying me for the prototype? We don't even know if it works. It might blow your hand off." "It will work," I said, with the confidence of an engineer who has checked his math 3 times. "And when it does, Brog, I'm going to need more, a lot more." I hid the weapon, my mana-lock pistol, inside my heavy coat. "What do you call it?" Brog asked as I opened the door. I paused. In this world, they named swords things like Soul Eater or Lightbringer. "It's a tool," I said simply. "Let's call it the Equalizer." I stepped out into the twilight. The architect finally had his pen. Now it was time to write some tragedy.
I signaled the carriage driver to stop near the tree line of the western woods. This was the gray zone, a stretch of land neither claimed by the city nor fully wild. It was where the desperate came to hunt and where the foolish came to die. "Stay here," I ordered the driver. "If you hear a loud noise, ignore it." I walked into the forest. The canopy blocked out the remaining twilight, plunging the world into shades of blue and black. The air grew colder. I could feel the ambient mana in the air shifting. Something was watching me. I stopped in a small clearing. It was the perfect testing ground. I reached into my coat and pulled out the Equalizer. The steel was cold against my palm. I flipped the latch and loaded a blue monocrystal into the chamber. It clicked into place with a satisfying mechanical snap. Safety off. I didn't have to wait long. A rustle in the bushes. Then 2 glowing yellow eyes appeared in the dark. A steel wolf. It stepped into the clearing, low to the ground, a growl vibrating in its throat.
It was huge, the size of a small horse. Its fur shimmered with a faint, translucent blue light, the mana barrier. This was the beast that the mercenaries at the guild had talked about, a creature that could shrug off sword strikes and arrows like they were rain. To a normal human without magic, this was death incarnate. To me, it was a target dummy. The wolf didn't rush. It circled me, sensing my lack of mana. It smelled my weakness. It knew I was a null. In its mind, I was already meat. "Come on," I whispered, raising the heavy pistol. "Show me your shield." The wolf lunged. It moved faster than anything I had ever seen on Earth, a blur of claws and teeth. Time seemed to slow down. My engineer's brain took over. I didn't see a monster. I saw a vector. I calculated the trajectory. I calculated the speed. I stood my ground. I didn't try to dodge. I wasn't fast enough. I had one chance, one shot. I aimed for the center of mass, right between the shoulders where the shield would be thickest. The wolf was 5 meters away. 3 meters. 2. I pulled the trigger. Boom! The sound wasn't magical. It was a thunderclap of pure physics. The recoil kicked my arm back violently, nearly dislocating my shoulder. A beam of condensed blue light erupted from the barrel. It didn't fizzle or curve like a spell. It traveled in a straight, brutal line. It hit the wolf mid-air. The mana barrier didn't just break, it shattered. The kinetic force of the blast was so high that the shield overloaded instantly. The beam punched through the magical defense, through the fur, through the muscle, and exited out the other side. The wolf was thrown backward as if it had been hit by a train. It slammed into a tree and slid down, motionless. Silence returned to the forest. Smoke curled from the barrel of my gun, smelling of ozone and burnt sulfur. I walked over to the carcass. The damage was catastrophic. A hole the size of a fist was burned clean through the chest. I touched the barrel of the gun. It was hot. "Hypothesis confirmed," I muttered, my voice shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline dump. I had done it. I had bypassed the laws of this world. I hadn't used a spell to match the wolf's power. I had used superior force to render its power irrelevant. I looked at my reflection in the dead wolf's eyes. I looked like a scholar in my coat and glasses, but I was holding a cannon in my hand. I was no longer prey. I ejected the spent crystal. It was gray, drained of all color, smoking on the grass. I reloaded, just in case. I turned back toward the carriage. The test was a success, but this was just a wolf. If I wanted to survive the Western ruins, if I wanted to open a dimensional rift, I would need more firepower, and I would need armor. The architect had his weapon. Now he needed his suit.
The carriage ride back to the manor was silent. My shoulder throbbed where the recoil had hit me, a dull ache that reminded me of my mortality. I had killed the wolf. I had proven the concept. But as the adrenaline faded, the cold logic returned. The Equalizer was powerful, yes, but it was slow. It took 5 seconds to eject the crystal and load a new one. In a real battle against multiple enemies, 5 seconds is an eternity. I was a glass cannon. One hit from a monster, one stray spell, and I would be dead before I could pull the trigger a second time. I needed protection. I needed armor, but not heavy plate mail that would slow me down, and not enchanted robes that I couldn't activate. I needed something forgotten. I walked past Sebastian in the hallway. He saw the soot on my face and the strange smell of ozone, but he didn't ask questions. He simply took my coat. "Prepare a light meal, Sebastian. I will be in the archive." I went straight to the library, pushed the black book, and descended into the shadows once again. This time, I ignored the political blackmail section. I walked to the dusty shelves at the very back, labeled Geography, Anomalies, and Lost History. My father wasn't just a spy for people. He spied on the land itself. He had mapped places that the royal cartographers were too afraid to document. I pulled out a scroll map of the western region. I traced the line from the city to the western ruins where the dimensional rifts were reported. If I go there now, I die. My finger drifted north of the ruins to a jagged mountain range marked with red ink. There was a note in my father's handwriting. The silent spire. Do not approach. Anti-mana field detected. I stopped. I reread the note. Anti-mana field. In this world, that was a curse. A zone where magic didn't just fail, it was actively drained. Any mage who entered the Spire would feel their life force being sucked out until they passed out or died. That's why it was abandoned. That's why no adventurer had looted it in centuries. It was a death trap for 99% of the population. But I am the 1%, the bottom 1%. I am a mana null. I have nothing to drain. The field would be invisible to me. I pulled another book, a history of the pre-collapse era. It spoke of an ancient civilization that relied on artifice rather than sorcery. They built suits of armor, called Aegis suits, designed to protect their engineers in hazardous environments. Kinetic dampening, thermal regulation, lightweight. If one of those suits was still inside that spire, I smiled. It was the perfect heist. The ultimate security system of this world was designed to keep out the powerful. It had a blind spot for the weak. To a grand mage, the Silent Spire is a tomb. To me, it's an open door. I rolled up the map and tucked it under my arm. I had the weapon. I had the location of the armor. Now I just had to solve the puzzle of getting inside. I walked back up the stairs, blowing out the lantern. The architect was going on an expedition. The architect had his weapon. Now he needed his suit.
The journey to the northern peaks took 2 days of hard riding. As we climbed higher into the mountains, the world began to lose its color. The lush green forests of the lowlands faded into gray scrub and jagged rock. Even the weather seemed to fear this place. The clouds hung low and heavy, but it didn't rain. It was a dry, static silence. My driver pulled the reins, stopping the carriage violently. The horses were screaming, a high-pitched, unnatural sound. They were foaming at the mouth, refusing to take another step. I opened the carriage door. "What is it?" The driver turned to look at me. He was a sturdy man, a veteran of the border wars, but his face was ashen. Blood was trickling from his nose. He was trembling uncontrollably. I can't breathe, sir," he gasped, clutching his chest. "The air, it's empty. It feels like drowning." I stepped out onto the rocky path. I took a deep breath. The air was crisp, cold, and thin, but it was breathable. I felt fine. In fact, I felt lighter than I had in years. I looked ahead. About 500 meters up the slope, a massive structure pierced the sky, the Silent Spire. It was a monolith of black obsidian and steel, untouched by time, standing like a tombstone over the mountain. Around it, there was an invisible perimeter, the dead zone. The anti-mana field, I realized. Every living thing in this world, humans, animals, plants, evolved with mana in their blood. It's part of their biology. Entering this field is like stepping into a vacuum. It sucks the life force right out of them. To the driver, standing on the edge of the field felt like radiation sickness. To me, it felt like home. "Turn back," I ordered the driver. "Take the horses down to the tree line. Wait for me there. Do not come closer or you will die." He didn't argue. He turned the carriage around with desperate speed and fled down the mountain. I was alone. I adjusted my backpack, filled with tools, rations, and my Equalizer, and began to walk. I crossed the invisible line. I expected a tingle, a shock, something, but there was nothing. Just the sound of my boots crunching on dead, gray grass. I walked past the skeletons of birds that had flown too close and dropped dead from the sky. I walked past the rusted armor of adventurers who had tried to force their way in centuries ago. They were powerful mages, probably, grand wizards who thought their spells could conquer anything. Now they were just bones in the dust. I looked at my hands. Steady, no pain. My lack of magic, the very thing that made me trash in society, was the only reason I was still standing. It was a supreme irony. I reached the base of the spire. Up close, the architecture was alien. It wasn't the flowing, organic style of the elves or the blocky stone of the dwarves. This was geometric, precise, industrial. It was built by a civilization that worshipped mathematics. The entrance was a massive blast door made of a dull gray metal. There were no keyholes, no magical runes to decipher, no riddles written in Elvish. There was just a heavy, circular locking mechanism with a series of gears and hydraulic pistons that had been frozen for 1,000 years. I put my hand on the cold metal. I felt the vibration of the dormant machinery inside. A mage would try to blast this door open. The field would absorb the spell and kill him. A warrior would try to smash it. The metal is harder than diamond. But an engineer? I pulled out a stethoscope from my bag, one of the tools I had bought in the iron quarter, and placed it against the door. I spun the outer ring of the lock. Click, clunk. I could hear the tumblers falling. I could visualize the internal mechanism. It was a combination lock, but based on fluid dynamics and weight distribution. "Physics," I whispered, smiling. "The universal language." I rolled up my sleeves. This wasn't going to be a battle of fire and lightning. This was going to be a battle of logic. And I had brought the right tools. I wiped a layer of gray dust from the center of the blast door. Underneath, I didn't find a keyhole. I found a complex array of 3 concentric rings, each etched with numerical notches. Not Elvish script, not Dwarven runes. Numbers, universal mathematical constants. At the center of the rings were 3 pressure valves, rusted shut. I placed my stethoscope against the cold metal casing. I tapped the first valve with my wrench. Clang! Thrum! The echo vibrated through the door. I listened to the decay of the sound. It wasn't solid. There was liquid inside. Hydraulic fluid, likely preserved in a vacuum seal. It's a pressure equalization lock, I realized. If you try to force the door, the hydraulic pressure spikes and jams the bolts. That's why the warriors failed. The harder you hit it, the harder it locks. To open it, I didn't need force. I needed finesse. I needed to bleed the pressure from the 3 chambers in a specific sequence to align the tumblers. I pulled a canister of penetrating oil from my bag, another purchase from the iron quarter, and sprayed the rusted valves. I waited 60 seconds, counting the heartbeats in the absolute silence of the dead zone. Then I attached my wrench to the outer valve, valve alpha. I turned it slowly. The metal screamed in protest, a high-pitched grinding sound that echoed down the mountain. 1 turn, 2 turns, stop. I listened. Hiss. Internal pressure releasing. I watched the first ring on the door rotate 5 degrees to the right. Good, I whispered. Now the counterweight. I moved to the inner valve, valve gamma. This one had to be turned in the opposite direction, simultaneously balancing the load. It was like cracking a safe, but the safe was the size of a building and the mechanism hadn't moved in 1,000 years. My muscles burned. Even without mana, the physical effort was immense. I turned the final valve. Clunk. A sound deep inside the mountain, like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant waking up. The 3 rings aligned perfectly, the geometric patterns connected to form a single continuous line from the center to the edge. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence returned. Then a low rumble shook the ground beneath my boots. Dust fell from the obsidian archway. The hydraulic pistons hissed, releasing centuries of compressed air. The massive blast doors didn't swing open. They split down the middle and retracted into the walls with a smooth, heavy mechanical glide. Groan. Darkness spilled out from the opening, but it wasn't the damp, rotting darkness of a dungeon. It was dry, sterile. I lit my lantern and stepped across the threshold. I expected to see a throne room or a treasure pile. What I saw made my engineer's heart skip a beat. It wasn't a tomb, it was a workshop. Rows of pristine metal workbenches, schematics etched into glass walls, tools that looked more advanced than anything in the capital. This was a facility from the pre-collapse era, a time when science ruled this world, before magic took over and made everyone lazy. I walked through the silent hall. My footsteps echoed on the metal grating floor. I am the first human to breathe this air in a millennia, I thought. And then I saw it. At the far end of the room, inside a glass display cylinder standing upright. It wasn't a suit of armor made of plate and chainmail. It was a sleek, segmented suit of matte black material woven with silver fibers. It looked organic and mechanical at the same time. The Aegis suit. I approached the glass. There was a plaque at the base. I wiped away the dust and read the engraving, Prototype Mark IV, Kinetic Redistribution and Environmental Hazard Protection for Industrial Use Only. I smiled. To the ancients, this was a hazmat suit for factory workers. To me, it was the ultimate battle armor. I placed my hand on the glass release panel. Hello, beautiful. Daddy's home.
I found the release latch on the side of the glass cylinder. I pulled it. A cloud of pressurized preservation gas vented into the room, smelling of ozone and sterile chemicals. The glass slid upwards. I reached out and touched the material of the suit. It wasn't cold like steel plate, nor was it rough like leather. It felt like a synthetic polymer, smooth, cool, and incredibly dense. It rippled under my touch like liquid mercury before hardening instantly. Nanofiber weave, I whispered. Impact hardening. I stripped off my heavy wool coat and my scholar's clothes. In this freezing, dead air, I should have been shivering, but the adrenaline kept me warm. I stepped into the suit. It didn't require straps or buckles. As soon as I slid my arms into the sleeves, the material reacted to my body heat. It contracted, tightening around my muscles, fitting me like a second skin. It wasn't constricting, it was supportive. I felt my posture straighten. The weight of my fatigue vanished, supported by the suit's internal structure. I picked up the helmet. It was a sleek, full-face visor made of black glass. I put it on. The world went dark for a split second. Then a soft chime sounded in my ears. Psst. System online. Text scrolled across my vision. Not on a screen, but projected directly onto my retina. Battery, 12%. Emergency mode. Kinetic dampeners, active. Environmental seal, integrity, 100%. A heads-up display, I gasped. I looked around the room. The suit highlighted objects in my vision. The workbench was outlined in green, the stairs in yellow. It was analyzing the geometry of the world in real time. I looked at my hands. I clenched my fist. I felt a low hum of power running through the synthetic muscles of the gloves. I walked to one of the metal workbenches. It was made of solid industrial steel. "Let's test the dampeners," I said. I drew my fist back and punched the steel surface, hard. In a normal scenario, I would have broken every bone in my hand. But the moment my knuckles made contact, the black material flashed silver. Crunch. I didn't feel pain. I felt a dull thud, like punching a pillow. But the metal workbench, it had a dent the size of a melon. The suit had absorbed the kinetic energy of the impact, dispersed it through the weave, and amplified the output. I looked at the dent, then at my hand. I laughed. A short, sharp laugh of victory. I am not a mage. I don't need to be. With this suit, I could survive a fireball. I could fall from a roof and land running. I could punch through a door. I grabbed my Equalizer pistol from the pile of clothes. I designed a magnetic holster on the thigh of the suit. The gun clicked into place as if it belonged there. I was no longer the scholar. I was no longer the Tresh noble. I looked at my reflection in the glass of the display case. A dark, faceless figure stared back, a phantom of technology in a world of superstition. Warning: battery low. Recharge required. The red text blinked in my vision. Right. It wasn't infinite. I needed to find a power source for the suit, just like I needed crystals for the gun. But that was a problem for another day. I turned back to the stairs. The silence of the spire didn't feel oppressive anymore. It felt like a sanctuary. I had raided the tomb of the ancients, and I was leaving with their inheritance. I walked out of the silent spire, stepping back into the gray light of the mountain. The anti-mana field was still there, killing everything around me. But inside my suit, the air was filtered, the temperature was controlled. I was untouchable. I began the descent down the mountain. Elara was coming back in 3 days. She is expecting a drunk husband. She is going to meet a warlord.
2 months, 60 days. That was the deadline written on the calendar in my study. To a lazy man, 2 months is a lifetime of leisure. To an engineer on a deadline, it is a blinking red light. The days evaporated into a blur of sweat, oil, and ink. My life became a rigid algorithm of efficiency. Phase 1. Integration. I spent the mornings in the gray zone, away from prying eyes. The Aegis suit was powerful, but it was demanding. It amplified my movements, but if I wasn't careful, I could tear a muscle or crush a bone by moving too fast. I had to relearn how to walk, how to run, how to jump. I ran until my lungs burned. I climbed trees, I smashed rocks, I pushed the suit to its limits, draining the battery to 5% and then recharging it using a crude mana converter Brogue had built from scrap. My body changed. The soft, doughy flesh of the old Aric melted away, replaced by lean, functional muscle. I wasn't a bodybuilder. I was a wire, pulled tight. Phase 2. Ballistics. Brogue delivered the ammunition crates weekly. He complained about the workload, but he never refused the gold I paid him. I practiced shooting until my hands were calloused and stained with gunpowder. Draw, aim, fire, reload. Draw, aim, fire, reload. I wasn't learning the art of the duel. I wasn't learning honor. I was learning to kill efficiently. I learned to compensate for the recoil. I learned to shoot while moving. I learned to target the weak points of magical barriers. I wasn't a swordsman. I was a gunman. And in this world, that made me an anomaly. Phase 3. The Architect. Evenings were for the mind. I descended into the archive of whispers. I didn't just read the secrets. I used them. I sent anonymous letters to 3 minor lords who were withholding taxes from the Valorian estate. I didn't threaten them with violence. I simply included a copy of their private correspondence with their mistresses. The taxes were paid the next morning, with interest. I used the gold to repair the manor. The roof was fixed, the gardens were tended, the staff was paid bonuses. Sebastian watched me through it all. He didn't say much, but his silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of judgment. It was the silence of a soldier waiting for orders. He kept the secret of my training excursions. He kept the world away from me. Week by week, the trash baron died a little more. I looked in the mirror on the final night. The man staring back wasn't the hungover wreck I had woken up as. His hair was tied back, sharp and severe. His eyes were cold, calculating, scanning for weaknesses. He stood straight, radiating a dangerous kind of calm. I checked the Equalizer. Clean. Loaded. I checked the Aegis suit, hidden in the false bottom of my wardrobe. Battery, 100%. The calendar on the wall showed the date. The 60 days were up. The preparation phase was over. The variables were set. The trap was laid. I sat down at my desk and picked up the document I had written on the very first day, the dissolution of marriage. Beside it, I placed the deed to the restored estate and a bank book filled with the gold I had recovered. Everything was ready for her. I blew out the candle. Come home, Elara. Let's end this.
The morning of the 61st day broke with a sky the color of bruised iron. I stood on the balcony of my bedroom, fully dressed, not in a loose, comfortable clothes of a drunkard, but in a tailored black suit with silver threading. It was sharp, austere, the uniform of a man who means business. I wasn't wearing the Aegis suit. That remained hidden beneath the floorboards, charged and ready. I wasn't carrying the Equalizer on my hip. Today, the battle wouldn't be fought with bullets. It would be fought with words, laws, and presence. A knock on the door. Precise. 3 taps. Enter, I said, without turning around. Sebastian stepped in. He was wearing his formal livery, his white gloves spotless. He looked like the steward of a great house again, not the caretaker of a ruin. "Sir," Sebastian said. His voice was steady, but I could hear the tightness in his throat. "Outriders have reported a convoy approaching the North Gate. The Everhart banner is flying." She was here. "How long?" I asked. 20 minutes, sir. The staff is assembled in the courtyard. The house is ready." I turned to face him. "And you, Sebastian, are you ready?" The old man hesitated. He had seen the old Aric crumble in Elara's presence 100 times. He remembered the shouting, the tears, the cold disdain in her eyes. He was afraid history would repeat itself. "She is formidable, my lord," Sebastian whispered. "Lady Elara does not suffer fools, and she remembers you as—" "She remembers a ghost," I interrupted gently. "Let her come. Let her see." I walked past him, out into the hallway. My boots clicked rhythmically on the polished marble.
a sound of confidence. I descended the grand staircase. The maids and servants were lined up in the foyer. They were nervous, straightening their aprons, whispering. When they saw me, they went silent. They bowed, not out of fear, but out of reliance. In 2 months I had given them stability. Now I had to defend it. I stepped out onto the main porch. The wind was picking up, whipping the leaves across the gravel driveway. In the distance, I saw it. A carriage of white wood and silver, pulled by 4 magical white horses. It was flanked by 6 battle mages on horseback, their staves glowing with latent power. The Everheart delegation, a parade of magical supremacy. It was intimidating. It was designed to be. It was a projection of power meant to remind the world that mages ruled and everyone else served. 2 months ago, I would have been trembling in my bed, a bottle of wine in my hand. Today, I checked my watch. Right on time, I murmured. I stood at the top of the stairs, hands clasped behind my back, my posture perfect. I watched the carriage roll through the open iron gates. Inside that carriage sat the most powerful woman in the kingdom, my wife, the woman I intended to divorce. She thinks she is coming home to a tragedy. She has no idea she is about to walk into a revolution. I looked at Sebastian. "Open the doors," I commanded. "Let the lady in."